This is an article from the Reformed Presbyterian, Volume 2, from April of 1838, entitled Slavery in the United States, a National Sin. That slavery is chargeable as a national sin upon the whole people of the United States has been proved by 4 distinct arguments. The attention of the readers now asks to a 5th consideration, which is of itself sufficient to establish the national guilt of this matter. Number 5. Slavery is recognized by the Constitution of the United States. Among the friends of humanity, some, whose determined hostility to slavery is well known, suppose they find its death warrant in the Constitution. We would be exceedingly gratified could this be satisfactorily made out. But after the most careful investigation of the subject and the arguments by which this opinion has been advocated, we are satisfied they are entirely fallacious. This view of the United States Constitution, instead of promoting the cause of freedom, is calculated to embarrass the question and involve it in great practical difficulty. It requires but little acquaintance with the state of sentiment in Congress, among leading politicians, and the great mass of the people, to see that the view proposed will be promptly and decidedly rejected. It provides a stronghold from which it may not be easy to drive the defenders of slavery. Let the discussion be brought to this point, and the attention will be turned from the sinfulness of slavery to the question of constitutionality. Pro-slavery men feel themselves too much pressed with arguments from reason and revelation, not to take advantage of this as a masked battery from behind which they may resist every attack. They would be pleased that the final determination of the question were put on this issue, and they know well it would end in the discomfiture of the friends of truth. It is a much easier task to prove that the federal Constitution is wrong on this point than that there are no provisions in it designed to support slavery in the slaveholding states. As a matter of historical fact, it is well known that the southern states did not give up the right of holding slaves when they entered into the Union. On the other hand, the northern states yielded the point and so far compromitted the principles of liberty. That the Constitution concedes the right of slaveholding was not only admitted, but acted upon by those who framed it. Mr. Madison says, quote, "The federal Constitution decides with great propriety on the case of our slaves when it views them in the mixed character of persons and of property. This is in fact their true character." Defending the provisions of the Constitution as he was, Mr. Madison neither would nor could have used such language as that now quoted if the right of holding slaves had not been included in it. All the commentators on the Constitution take this view of it. The uniform action of Congress on the subject of slavery, ever since the adoption of the Constitution, proceeds directly from the same view. In less than 6 years from the time of its adoption, they passed the law respecting fugitive slaves, from which a quotation has been given in a preceding part of this article. It would be strange indeed if, notwithstanding all these facts, opinions, laws, and practices, in one unbroken continuity from the period of framing the Constitution till the present, it should be ascertained that they are all mistaken. But stranger still than this discovery should not have been made till half a century had passed. It is most cheerfully granted that there are principles in the federal Constitution which, had they not been made nugatory by the provisions in it, would have given the death blow to slavery. But the truth is, these principles were never designed to take effect in regard to that part of the population which is held in bondage. The Constitution was not made for them but for their masters. Its framers proceeded on the ground that a portion of the population were held in slavery and might be retained in that condition, and for the security of their rights it should be no palladium, for the plain reason that they were not considered to have any rights. This is not indeed said in the Constitution, but it is implied in several of its provisions, and has been uniformly acted upon for 50 years. It was too much for the consistency of even slave-holding patriots openly to avow slavery in the federal Constitution, but the thing itself is there, no matter by what name it may be disguised, or by what circumlocution its direct mention may be avoided. The galling yoke is not the less felt by the slave, because the Constitution may speak of him as a person. The extreme affectation of delicacy kept up by abstaining from the use of the terms slave or slavery is an example of the political hypocrisy unparalleled in the history of legislation. The amendment to the Constitution which says, quote, "No person shall be deprived of liberty without due process of law," unquote, was designed for the white and not the colored man, for the master and not the slave. Had it been otherwise, the 500,000 of slaves which were in the United States at the time of adopting the federal Constitution would, as a matter of course, been instantly freed. Not one of them was convicted and doomed to slavery by, quote, due process of law, unquote. It is of no avail that in this amendment the expression no person is used without any exception. It was not made for the slaves nor their benefit, but that of their oppressors. Perhaps we may be told that an implied understanding of a law cannot be urged in opposition to its plainly expressed terms. Be it so. We do not argue on the ground of an implied understanding merely, but on the obvious meaning of the instrument as far as it relates to this subject. The obligations attached to the terms of a covenant are those, and those only, which are mutually received by the parties contracting. The terms of the covenant may be very imperfectly expressed, but the meaning attached to these terms, mutually by the parties at the time of entering into the contract, fixes the obligations of the covenant. The federal Constitution is a bond or covenant binding the states together in one national confederacy. The real and proper meaning of the provisions which it contains is such as was given to them at the time of confederation, and in which they were received by the parties respectively. Now, at the time the Constitution was framed, and from that time till the present, the parties respectively have received it, as including the right of holding slaves. Its uniform interpretation, whether by those who framed it or by other eminent individuals, that the invariable action of the national government prove that it secures to the slave-holding states the right of slaveholding and guards the right by obligations binding the free states. We refer to the three following provisions of the Constitution on the subject. First, quote, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this Union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and including Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons, unquote. Constitution of the United States, Article 1, Section 2. That the persons spoke of in the last part of this quotation are slaves is evident from the language of the preceding part. They stand opposed to and are contrasted with the, quote, whole number of free persons, unquote. If in this quotation, quote, free persons, unquote, are spoken of, certainly there are some who are not free. These last are included in the words, quote, 3/5 of all other persons. It is a mere evasion to say, because they are here called persons, they cannot be slaves. Slaves are spoken of as property or as persons, just as it might suit the views or promote the interest of their masters. To secure absolute control over the slave, to his master, the law views him as property and ranks him with chattels. But if the master's interest can be promoted by the mutation, the law immediately recognizes him as a person. But as the slave does not cease to be a man, because the law considers him as the master's property, neither does he cease to be a slave, although the law may speak of him as a person. The view given by Mr. Madison of that part of the Constitution which we are now examining, and his judgment not only stands uncontradicted, but has been universally adopted and acted upon is, quote, we must deny the fact that slaves are considered merely as property and in no respect whatever as persons. The true state of the case is that they partake of both of these qualities, being considered by our laws in some respect as persons and in other respects as property. The federal Constitution, therefore, decides with great propriety on the case of our slaves when it views them in the mixed character of persons and of property, unquote. In fixing the ratio of representation in the federal Constitution, it was the interest of the Southern states that their slaves should be taken into the calculation, hence the adoption of the 3/5 principle. Every slave counting 3/5 of a man. The adoption of this principle gave no advantage to the slaves, but it gave an immense advantage to slave-holding states, as it increased their number of representatives in Congress, according to the ratio originally fixed. Every 30,000 citizens were entitled one representative in Congress. By this ratio, the 3/5 principle gave an additional representative for every 50,000 slaves. This increased representation, however, does not represent the slaves nor their interests, but the masters and their interests. And for the attainment of this, the federal Constitution speaks of them as persons, but they are nevertheless persons in the condition of slaves.